This video is sponsored by World of Warships Legends. Stick around until the end of the video to find out how you can rule the seas in your own aircraft carrier. Hey everybody, it's Chris from Military Aviation History, and I thought we'd do something really special today, and that is look at some archive footage from the Battle of Midway. Now the clips I have chosen here are all tagged as Battle of Midway footage at the National Archives in the US, and I'll be showing you the clip references here, so you can also have a look at the actual website and look at the clips yourself in full if that is something you want to do. Links are, as always, for sources in the description below. So what I want to do today is really do two things. First things first, we're going to look at some of the sequences of this original footage, analyze it, look at the details, and really discuss what this tells us about the Battle of Midway, if the footage is in fact from the Battle of Midway. That is the first question we have to ask ourselves as well, and I'll go more into that as the video progresses, and also just hone in on some of those things that might go missing if you just watch the footage from start to finish in one sitting without really just breaking it down frame by frame. Sometimes there's really a few things here that are worth discussing. But the second thing I want to talk about, and we also start this discussion with you guys, is the use of archive footage. Be it here on YouTube. I mean, I sometimes use archive footage in my videos, as you know, but also in documentaries, on TV and so on, and really discuss how this footage was made back in the day when it was filmed, and some of the pitfalls of using it nowadays, because it can in fact create very sort of specific illusions inside the viewer, inside us as we are watching, for example, a documentary, whereas the footage that we're actually watching, the interpretation that we're superimposing on that footage from ourselves and also what the narrator is telling us might not always be that accurate. So I want to launch off that discussion once again here with you guys. So let's just get going with the first sequence. Okay, so the first clip here, what we see is of course the deck of a carrier. Up front we have a couple of dauntlesses, as you can see. Those are nicely set up, and you can see how they are aligned and organized on the flight deck, trying to use that space to the max, trying to set them up in such a way, staggered really in such a way that the wings can just stagger into each other, almost like a puzzle. And that's how you crowd a deck space with as many planes as possible, because you want to of course avoid that time of resetting the flight deck, getting planes from the hangar up, then having them take off. You want to have all those planes ready from the get-go. Interesting here as well, in the back you see a couple of different planes. Those are TBD Devastator, so the torpedo bombers that the US Navy started out with World War II and really sort of got rid of after the Battle of Midway. They were already in that process of changing the torpedo squadrons to the Avenger, but the Avenger came slightly too late for that, for this battle at least. The reason why you can identify them is, first of all, the nose is slightly different. The Dauntless really has that sort of distinctive nose with that big radial engine. Of course, radial engine is also installed in the TBD Devastator, albeit a different model, but you can also see that from the wing fold. So the TBD Devastator has a folding wing. It's one of the first monoplanes actually that has this. The TBD Devastator, although it has a poor reputation, was actually in certain ways a trailblazer for the US Navy. It was once one of the most modern aircraft out there. I have a complete video on this as well if you're interested. But it has a wing fold, whereas the Dauntless does not have a wing fold, and you can see that quite clearly here. And you can also, well, you can't really make it out in this footage, but you can sort of guess the advantage of having a wing fold on a US Navy carrier plane. With the Dauntless, that was not the case. Now, as we continue with this footage here, let's talk about a couple of different things then. We'll just have a look as the squadrons seem to be getting ready to depart, and here we go. We've got a couple of planes taking off, and that's a Dauntless taking off. As you will notice, there is no ordnance hanging off these planes. There will actually be one or two that have some bombs, but as we pause it right here, let's say, yeah, let's go back slightly. There we go, that's better. I want to talk about the markings on this plane. You will see that prominent white star on a dark blue background with the red dot in the middle. Now, even though this footage is said to be from the Battle of Midway, at least that's the header on the actual clip when you search it in the National Archives, this marking was already out of date by the Battle of Midway. So it's most likely that this footage was shot somewhere between the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, which happened relatively close after each other. And during the Battle of the Coral Sea, that red dot was still there. Now the US Navy got rid of that because it assumed, and probably quite rightly assumed, that anything red on their aircraft might by accident be mistaken for a Japanese aircraft, because the Japanese, of course, used a prominent red roundel, no fancy stuff attached to it, just red. And that, of course, creates the impression in pilots that anything that is red is an enemy. And as soon as they hone in on something red on an aircraft, they might interpret it as being a Japanese aircraft. In fact, during World War II, sort of friendly fire incidences, especially between AA defenses and aircraft, are very, very common, because while you would think everybody knows what these aircraft look like, even from afar, that is not always a given, and it's actually quite difficult sometimes to make out different shapes, especially if you are in a dogfight. For example, the Luftwaffe, just making a quick excursion to the European theater, the Luftwaffe got rid of any sort of red on their aircraft as well, as they were essentially invading the Soviet Union, because they feared that anything red on their aircraft will immediately be confused with a Soviet aircraft, because the Soviets, of course, also use a lot of red and have that prominent red star as their national markings. So US Navy, same thing here. They got rid of that red roundel, or that red dot in the middle of the white star for the Battle of Midway, and most, if not all, Navy squadrons no longer had this roundel. It was updated. On the back you can also see the white and red markings there on the rudder. Those would eventually also be deleted, and you see this nice little white diagonal line coming down from the sort of mid rudder towards the starting edge of the vertical stabilizer. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later as well. And actually on this footage you can also nicely see the flaps, which double as air brakes, and the Dauntless, of course, here set for takeoff, and what appears to be a single bomb. Now, as we are continuing with this footage here, you'll see more Dauntlesses taking off, you'll see more Devastators taking off as well. And yeah, they seem to be either not armed at all or have one or two bombs, but very light bombs attached to them. And what this is telling us, that this is probably, together with the roundel issue, not footage from the Battle of Midway, but like I said, something in the aftermath of the Coral Sea, maybe some miscellaneous sorties, shall I say, some practice runs with bombs perhaps, that is happening here. Which I think this is our first Devastator taking off here. And you can see no torpedo. Devastator, the torpedo on the Devastator would stick out quite prominently from the aircraft, because it's set at that angle. I'll talk about that in just a few minutes as well, because there's more footage of that as well. So for the next sequence I have to pause it immediately, because sadly there's only a couple of frames. But what we're seeing here is, yes, updated markings. So there is no longer a red dot within that white star. What else can we see on this footage? A couple of things actually. First of all, you can see how the pilot and the gunner are flying with their canopies opened. With the Dauntlesses, this was also a case of when they were actually going for their dives. Sometimes they would leave that canopy open just slightly to have a little bit of ventilation to prevent the fogging of their canopy. The other thing, of course, we have a bomb under the right wing. Probably that is doubled with another bomb under the left wing. The really interesting thing about this footage is, however, the letter and number sequence that we see just aft of the white on blue star. And this is essentially the type of squadron that this aircraft is attached to, as well as the number of the aircraft. Now, when the US Navy starts the war, they have a slightly different sequence. They have the first number in the sequence would designate the squadron's number, then the letter would designate the type of squadron, and then the last number, just like here, would designate the number of the actual aircraft in that squadron. As you can see here, the squadron number has been omitted, and there's good reasons for that. Now, first of all, the US Navy has a very simple system. For example, take CV2 USS Lexington. This is, so to say, the second carrier in the US Navy, hence CV2. And any squadron attached to that carrier would also carry the number 2. So we would have VF2 as the fighters, VB2 as the Dauntlesses, VS2 also as Dauntlesses, and VT2 as the torpedo bombers. There's only one or two exceptions where a squadron was detached from a carrier and a different squadron was put on that carrier for a transitionary period, for example, where this rule does not apply. But of course, if you are the enemy and you're under attack, or you spot one of these aircraft and you happen to get the number sequence on the side of the aircraft, then you can of course say, oh, that started with a number 2. That means that this aircraft comes from USS Lexington, which means of course that USS Lexington is in the area. And that is an intelligence fail, let's say, on the side of the US Navy, and they of course wisely started to omit those numbers so that it is more ambiguous of who these planes belong to. The B in this case stands for a bombing squadron, so every carrier would carry VS and VB, so that's scouting and bombing. And these would both be equipped with SBD Dauntlesses, usually with a slightly different loadout. The scouting Dauntlesses would have a lighter bomb loadout, whereas the bombing Dauntlesses would have a heavier bomb load. And then of course the number here after that is the aircraft in the formation. And by the way, the number of the aircraft has absolutely no relevance to the pilot that is sitting in it. On paper, you could assume that, for example, the first plane in the formation would be used by the squadron's commander. That is not the case. In fact, if you go through the roster, especially also for the Battle of Midway, and you look at who flew what aircraft and what that number of the aircraft is, you'll see, for example, the squadron commanders of various squadrons flying in totally different aircraft every single time they go up for a sortie. And it's just a question of availability. Nobody really had a reserved aircraft just for themselves. But now look at the tail again. You see once again that prominent white diagonal line there, and that is in fact for the LSO, the landing signal officer, and that allows him, as the plane comes into land on the carrier, to better align the aircraft with the approach. But we're also going to talk more about the LSO later, so just wait for that. Okay, now we're just going to have to continue here. We'll enjoy some footage from SBD Dauntlesses. Taking off here, you see S-14. That means it is of course part of a scouting squadron. And we have another plane coming out, S9 I believe that was, and now we have a TBD Devastator. We can be relatively sure here at this point that this Devastator is attached to VT8. This is of course the squadron, well, one of the squadrons that suffers heavily, but VT8 really just gets slaughtered, and there's only one survivor, George Gay, during the Battle of Midway. The reason why we can be relatively sure of that is look at the gunner seat, and you'll see a twin vertical. Generally speaking, TBD Devastators would only be armed with a single vertical, but before the Battle of Midway, Waldron, the commander of VT8, decides to get a couple of spare twin verticals from the Dauntlesses on his carrier, the USS Hornet, and place them on his TBD Devastators in sort of a retrofit to give them more defensive firepower. Didn't work out for VT8 because they were lost essentially to one survivor. But it's a nice little sort of detail that sometimes gets a little bit lost as you're watching this footage, and we can be pretty much assured that this is one of the planes from VT8. And of course then look at the torpedo. You can see that the torpedo, as the plane is taking off, of course the plane, since it's a tail dragger, is sort of set at an angle to the deck, right, as it's taking off. The torpedo, however, is parallel to the deck, which means that as soon as the plane goes into a horizontal position, which it would have to assume once it launches its torpedo, its fish, then the torpedo is actually set at an angle. And the reason why this was done is it was assumed that this eases the transition from the air into the water for the torpedo for its final run against an enemy ship. Now, of course, the US Navy had some issues with their torpedoes early on in the war, so it was a good idea, but the torpedo itself wasn't that great. But this is also something that we're not seeing anymore with other planes, for example, like the TBF or TBM Avenger, because they have an internal bomb bay, and the torpedo is, of course, placed there, and the bomb bay doors just open, torpedo drops out, and we don't see something like this there anymore. So that's a nice little detail with the TBD Devastator as well. Okay, so with this next clip, I want to do things slightly different. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you roughly, I believe, 60 seconds of footage, and I'm just going to be quiet. I'm not going to say a word, and you're going to be able to enjoy it in the way it was edited back then. There is no editing on my part. The sound effects are as I found them when I downloaded the file from the National Archives, and the narrator is also the original one. So just sit back, enjoy, and just watch what happens and make your own conclusions first.
Navy planes roared from the decks of our carriers, army bombers, marines, thundered destruction over a 300-mile battle area. Forces were hit and hit and hit again.
So this footage was of course under the header of Battle of Midway, and you should also know that the Battle of Midway was a battle that was extremely well cataloged, let's say, in the video format, because John Ford and his camera team, which later on released an 18-minute long movie called The Battle of Midway, filmed a whole lot of action sequences during the battle, but also before the battle. They were attached to various carriers where they started filming the action there, the training exercises, and so on and so forth. So as you're watching this footage now, we're just going to slow down a couple of things and see really what happens. So as we're watching this footage here, we can of course see Chicago Pineanos being loaded, aircraft taking off. Here's that TBD Devastator again, and Chicago Pianos are firing. Those black puffs of smoke are not from the Chicago Pianos, by the way. Those are from time delay fuses from the heavier AA guns, or dual purpose guns really. And once again, planes flying. We seem to be in the middle of the action here. And then appears to be an aircraft dive bombing. But if you look at the shape of this aircraft, this is not a Japanese aircraft. This is, from the shape, I would say, an SBD Dauntless. Nice little vortexes, by the way, on the wings there as it pulls up out of a dive. So that makes us question things a little bit as we pause that footage, and then we see something burning in the water, AA guns just firing. Oh, and there's planes all around the carrier. What's going on? There's smoke, okay. And as we're slowing it down now, just look at these planes, and you'll actually notice that these are not Japanese planes. This, for example, is a TBD Devastator. And you saw this little splash there in the water earlier from when it was coming towards the cameraman, or slightly at an angle. What was that splash? Well, let's continue with the footage. Now this, on the other hand, is a Japanese airplane. This is probably a D3A, a dive bomber, being attacked by most likely a Wildcat. We don't exactly know. Again, AA guns firing. And here, look at these shapes. Those are TBD Devastators. Absolutely. Again, we see some splashes in the water. What's going on there? Big puffs of smoke again. Of course, you remember in the original footage there was a lot of battle noise going on here. And then we have a Dauntless making circles, guns firing. Oh, and there's a random TBD Devastator once again in the footage, just flying from one side to the other. So what's going on here is that AA footage, AA fire, is being edited together with what is most likely a US Navy exercise. The smoke in the background is probably artificially made to obscure the battlefield a little bit, make it a bit harder for pilots to find their targets. They are dummy targets, of course, and also just to get people accustomed to a little bit of more chaotic battle space. And the splashes that you saw earlier that were accompanying the approaches of these planes, those were dummy bombs or dummy torpedoes. And really what's happening here is the US Navy is practicing. But that practice footage is being cut into sequences of a battle. And now assume that you're somebody who is just watching this footage as part of a documentary, and you're not really pausing every single bit of trying to figure out what these aircraft actually are, because the sequences are quite quick, right? And you would have to know the aircraft shapes really in order to be 100% sure these are American or Japanese planes. In this case, they are American planes. You're being fed essentially an edited version back already in World War II. Maybe this footage was released as well, of how this battle was supposed to look, but actually what's happening is here just a couple of AA guns firing and practice footage, or from a US Navy practice session being superimposed into a battle, let's say. And if you want to have a quick look here as well, I have some more additional footage from a different clip where you can actually see this practice, and here you can see the power of editing, because what we see here is a lot more long, slow angles, and we see this footage that it was used earlier, there we go, being reused as well, but it doesn't cut as quickly, and it doesn't also cut with AA guns, right? And you can see how the editing really creates a completely different illusion and completely different reality that we're watching. It's a lot more slow, it's a lot more collected, and you can really make out the shapes of those Devastators there. And instead of using, you know, tiny sequences of this, instead of using tiny sequences from this footage and editing it together with battle sounds and AA guns, you're actually seeing a US Navy exercise, which is as interesting, really. If you want to see what, let's say real, or most likely real defensive fire looks like, watch this footage. We already see a couple of black smoke puffs there. Those are of course from the bigger dual purpose guns firing at an aircraft with delay fuses, time delay fuses. And you can also see splashes on the water from lighter caliber guns. And later on, we'll also most likely be seeing something like a Chicago piano firing, especially from the tracers. There you can see the splashes in the water. And you can see the target there. It's a small, it looks like a biplane. And I would like to say that it is probably a Japanese recon plane, but to be honest, we never really know. At this resolution, there's no really way of making it out. But you can see really how really guns are firing at this target. And if the sequence we saw earlier with all those planes around the carrier was real, we'd be seeing a lot more fire. And first of all, so those planes wouldn't go that close. They would drop their ordnance from way further off. But here you can see, the guns firing at this plane. It's constantly changing altitude, trying to throw off the gunners, and that's how, let's say, real defensive fire looks like. Although even then, that could be an edited sequence in the way that was set up. Then we are going to have a look at some footage of Navy aircraft landing. We see a Dauntless coming in, and that was a rough landing there. But you can see as the planes are coming in, we're also going to be talking about the LSO now, so the landing system officers. Let's rewind it just slightly here. You can see how as the plane passes the deck or onto the deck, that the screen on the right hand side is lowered, and that is where the LSO, the landing signal officer, stands, waving, well, not really waving, but guiding the aircraft in. As it lands, you can see two men on the back running towards the hook to free up the aircraft so it can move up front and be taken down below. Whereas you of course want to have the next aircraft landing as soon as possible. So this is why that is done immediately. And you can also see one man to the right of the aircraft, now to the left of the screen, staying in contact, in visual contact with the pilot and letting him know once everything is set up. We've got a Wildcat there. Once again, you see men running towards the plane. And now let's look at the LSO. You can see the LSO is slightly to the right of the screen here. Now what the LSO has as his weapon of choice are two paddles. And these are the most powerful tools on the US carrier right in this moment. These panels are usually colored in such a way that they contrast heavily with the background, which is usually, not in this case as you can see, but usually the screen that is behind him. And that allows the pilot to have a visual identify the paddles and know where they are and what sort of command is being given to him, rather than have the paddles blend in with the background and making it harder. The pilot, as he is approaching the carrier, focuses on the LSO. He's not looking at the carrier, he's not looking at the deck, he's looking at the LSO, and he has to trust the LSO to guide him in properly. The LSO right now, the way he is set up, we can just zoom in on that just slightly. What you can see the LSO doing at this point is one arm is higher than the other. He has them both outstretched, but one is higher than the other. And this is called slant. And this indicates to the pilot the angle that he's supposed to be flying into. And as slant, eventually, as he's aligning up with the carrier, he goes into Roger, which is essentially just the LSO making a cross with his arms sticking out perpendicular from his body. And as we then continue this sequence, Dauntless landing, oof, a little bit of a bounce there. I think the next sequence is the one that I really want to, yes, this is the one. Now watch what happens here as the Dauntless passes onto the deck. There, no, slightly more, there we go. You can see the screen lowered. And the LSO is in a little bit of an action pose there. And what he's going to be doing is he's going to, with his right hand, he's going to make a slashing motion towards his chest. Actually his throat, really. And that means cut. And upon seeing this command, the pilot switches his attention away from the LSO and he starts to look at the deck. Because he knows at this point the LSO has done everything that he can to guide me in. Now it's my time to set down this aircraft on the deck. He cuts the throttle immediately as well, so he throttles back, hence the command cut. And he then just evens out the aircraft, watches where the deck is, flares slightly to try to get that 3-point landing, so the hook gets one of the cables that you can see stretched out across the deck. And there we can see the LSO just gave the command. He made that slashing motion, and that was a really nice landing, by the way. That was a really nice landing. And immediately you can see the two fellows just running towards the hook, trying to get the aircraft free and then having it move up. And once again, you can also see the diagonal lines here on the vertical stabilizer, which help the LSO, or which are supposed to help the LSO come in, judge the angle for the aircraft to come in. Mind you, you don't see this on every plane, and sometimes you see one line, sometimes you see two lines. I'm not quite sure how official these markings were. It seems that they were maybe something a little bit more unofficial, and the way it was done really depends on the squadron and sometimes also on the pilots. So yeah, that essentially is a landing sequence in a nutshell during this time in the US Navy. Let's move on. And here we see a couple of pilots. Now, the pilots are holding what appears to be this wooden board, right? And that is in fact what it is. This is their most important navigational tool that they have. It slots in a space below the instruments, but above the stick. So you can pull it out during flight and push it back in when you don't need to. And what it is it's essentially a tracking chart. And you can set up a pre-designated courses that you were given as an order to fly a certain patrol, to fly a certain heading towards the enemy fleet. And you're tracking your way on this map so that you don't lose where you are. Because while the US Navy does have these homing beacons and these homing receivers installed in their aircraft, at this point in the war, they don't really work that well. And you always want to have a second or third backup just in case. So what you're going to see, oh, there's Fatch, by the way. That would be Fatch. And you can see another one getting out of his aircraft with his navigational board. And I think there's one sequence where we can get a really good look at it. We'll just have to wait for this man to get out. There we go. So you can see a little bit better here. You can see that tracking chart on the board, and every pilot would be using one of these in his Wildcats, trying to track his course and be essentially in a way responsible for his own location and knowing where he is at all times. Because, for example, during a dogfight, he might be split from his squadron mates, and he has to find his own way home. Hope that I aroused some interest in you for this sort of footage, analyzing this sort of footage. Tell me what you think about it down below in the description as well. If you're surprised of seeing sort of the way that footage was editing, if you think this is completely normal. In fact, I must say, you know, this footage was used also for propaganda, of course, so it's not really a surprise in a way. And you know, it's also something that, for example, let's make once again an excursion to the European theater of war, right? If you're watching a documentary and you see footage of, let's say, German tanks rolling into a country, an undisclosed country, but a narrative says, you know, this is a blitzkrieg being unleashed on the Soviet Union. The footage that you might be watching is actually from the campaign in France or even the campaign in Poland. And unless you really know what tank models to look for and what really look out for, you would never know. And I hope I also aroused some interest in this early phase of aviation, in this really transition phase of naval aviation in the Pacific, because you can of course relive this transition period in the game World of Warships Legends, today's sponsor. World of Warships Legends is a free multiplayer game on Xbox and PlayStation that has recently added carriers for all players to use. Now, they would like me to tell you that the game has epic battles, customization, a large variety of ships, and free progression for all players through the game for both ships and your captains. But let's be honest, you know these things already. So let me give you an offer you simply cannot refuse. Carriers! Yes, carriers are here, and carriers mean aircraft, which means that you have absolutely no excuse not to try it for free, because how could you say no to an aircraft? Experience the real-world transition in-game as you progress from interwar biplanes to modern strike aircraft, amongst which are planes you saw in this video, like the SPD Dauntless, the TBD Devastator. Ooh, lovely pre-war camouflage on that one. And as you follow the lines of US and Japanese carriers, you hunt down one floating target after the other, scout the enemy fleet, launch torpedoes, and drop bombs to unleash all manner of beautiful chaos and calamity upon your enemies. And as the enemy team succumbs to your perfectly executed attacks, they too will start to understand that air power is where it is at. So what are you waiting for? Get yourself a carrier, launch your strikes, and win the day one match at a time. Get World of Warships Legends now on Xbox and PlayStation via the link in the description below. It's free!